My name is Millie Halstead, and I'm 33 years old. On Christmas Eve when I was 18, my father wrote 2 words on cardboard in thick black marker, punched holes through the corners, and hung it around my neck like a price tag. Family disgrace. My mother pointed to the corner and told me to face the wall, while my brother tore open presents and the rest of the family passed plates of food 3ft behind my back. No one said a single word. Not one person stood up. I left that house before midnight with the signs still in my hands, and I never walked back through that door. 15 years later, their lawyer called me with a question only I could answer. I gave him one word. By sunset, 42 missed calls sat on my phone. They believed that sign had defined me for life. They were wrong about what it actually set in motion. If you've ever been treated like the problem in your own family, this story is for you. Drop a comment and tell me where it happened. Subscribe. Because the part that comes after that one word is the part they never saw coming. The house I grew up in was not really my parents' house. It belonged to my grandmother, Vivian, and it sat at the end of a quiet street in Martin, Ohio, about an hour and a half north of the city where I live now. My grandfather had died 2 years earlier, and after the funeral, my parents moved in to help her. That was the phrase my mother used. Help. Within a year, they had taken over the master bedroom, the checkbook, and the calendar. Vivian slept in the room that used to be a sewing room and asked permission to have people over. My mother, Sandra, ran our family the way some people run a small business that only sells one product, reputation. She the fall festival committee at church. She kept a binder of thank you cards she had received and a separate one for the cards she still owed. When she said, "This family has a name to protect," she was not being dramatic. She meant it as a job description, and she meant it for me. My father, Dale, was quieter. He worked as an insurance adjuster, which is a career built entirely on deciding whose story the paperwork will believe. He was good at it. He could look at a wrecked car and a crying driver and tell you calmly what the file would say by Friday. At home, he did what the file told him to do, and the file was my mother. Then there was Grant. My older brother was the family's one product, polished daily. He had a jaw like a recruiting poster and a nomination to West Point that fall, the kind of thing that gets announced at church and printed in the Martin Weekly. On the mantel, there were 3 of his trophies and a framed letter with a gold seal. There was nothing of mine on that mantel, and I had stopped expecting there to be. I want to be careful here because the version they told everyone was that I ruined things. So let me tell you what actually happened in the order I lived it without the ending they wrote for me. One night that October, the phone rang at 1:00 in the morning. I remember the headlights sweeping across my bedroom ceiling before the ring, a car turning too fast into our street. Grant had taken the family sedan to a party. He came home on foot, wet and shaking, and there was a smell coming off him that I knew even at 18. Beer, and under it, something sour like fear. He had hit a man. The car was in a ditch 2 miles away, one headlight punched in, the front fender folded. The man's name Trevor Nash. He was 19, walking home along the shoulder, and Grant's car had thrown him into a mailbox and shattered his leg in 3 places. My father did not call the police first. He called his office voicemail out of habit. And then he stood in the kitchen in his undershirt and said the sentence I have never forgotten. "Let me handle the report." Nobody says anything yet. Then my mother turned, not to Grant, who was the one who had been driving. She turned to me. "You'll say you were driving," she said. She said it the way you'd ask someone to grab the mail. "You're 18 now. It's different for you. You'll barely feel it. I need you to understand how it works because it is the reason I could still become what I became." Nobody tested Grant that night. By the time anyone official saw the scene, he had been home for an hour and a story had already been decided, and the story was me. There was no way to prove who had been drinking, so it was never treated as a drunk driving case at all. I was written down as the driver. I got a careless driving ticket, which is not a crime, just a slip of paper and a fine. And Mr. Nash's shattered leg was handled the way my father handled everything, through insurance. $85,000 quietly in a civil settlement with my name on it. I signed a page that night that I did not write. My father held the pen out and I took it because I was 18, and I loved them, and I was afraid. And because they told me it was the only way to save Grant's future. I told myself I was protecting the family. That is the story I lived in for 2 months. But 2 months is a long time to carry a lie for someone who never thanked you. By December, I could not sleep. I would lie in bed and picture Trevor Nash on crutches and think about how my brother was still going to West Point on the strength of a lie I had signed. I told one person the truth. I told Vivian. We were in her small kitchen, the one they had left her, drinking tea. When I finished, she put her hand over mine and pressed down like she was keeping me from floating away. "The truth doesn't stop being true because it's inconvenient," she said. I decided I was going to say it out loud at Christmas in front of the whole family so that no one could pretend later that they hadn't heard. I thought that if enough people knew, they would have to do the right thing. I was 18. I believed that. What I did not know is that my mother found out I had been talking to Vivian and that she began, very quietly, to prepare something for Christmas Eve. The house always looked its best on Christmas Eve. There was a real tree, tall enough to touch the ceiling, wrapped in the red ribbon my mother saved and reused every year. The good china came out of the cabinet. In the garage, there were flattened liquor boxes waiting to be recycled after the holidays because my mother did not believe in wasting good cardboard. I got there in the early evening, and the first thing my mother said to me was, "Smile. People are watching." I was helping carry chairs from the dining room when I saw it. Behind the tree, half hidden between the trunk and the wall, there was a rectangle of cardboard. It had been cut clean and squared off with scissors. 2 holes had already been punched through the top corners. I did not understand what it was for. I only felt the small wrong note of it, a made thing waiting in a room where nothing else was unfinished. I put it out of my mind. That is the part I would replay for years. The relatives arrived. My Aunt Deborah, my mother's younger sister, came with a pie and a nervous look she wore like a coat. Cousins filled the living room. Grant held court by the fireplace in a sweater the color of the trophies behind him. Before anyone opened a single present, my mother stood in the center of the room and clinked a fork against her glass, the way you do for a toast. "Before we open anything," she said, and her voice was warm and even, "this family needs to be honest about who nearly destroyed us this year." My father came out of the kitchen holding the cardboard. Up close, I could read the 2 words on it now, in his blocky handwriting, the same hand that filled out claim forms all day. Family disgrace. A length of the red ribbon had been threaded through the 2 holes he'd punched. He walked toward me. I remember thinking absurdly that it looked like a price tag, the kind they loop over a mannequin's neck in a shop window. He lifted it over my head and settled the ribbon on my shoulders. And the cardboard hung against my chest, and the room went completely silent. "There," my mother said. She pointed to the corner by the front window where the tree cast a shadow. "Face the wall. You can stand there and think about what you cost this family." I looked at my father. His eyes were down. "Just stand there," he said, so quietly only I could hear it. "Don't make it worse." So I stood in the corner. Behind me, I heard the ordinary sounds of Christmas resume, wrapping paper, my cousin laughing at something, the scrape of serving spoons against my grandmother's good china. My name was not called when the plates went around. There were 15 people in that house and a place at the table for every one of them except me. I kept my back to them and I waited for one chair to scrape backward. I waited for one person to stand up. Not one of them did. I could feel Vivian across the room. She was sitting in the armchair by the lamp, and I know now what it cost her to stay in it because in her own house she had learned that standing up got you managed. She did not move. But at one point I turned my head just slightly and her eyes found mine, and there was something in them I did not have a name for yet. It would take me 15 years to learn the word. At some point, Grant lifted his phone. "Smile for the family album," he said, and there was a small flash and a few of them laughed, and my brother recorded the daughter who had taken the blame for his crime, standing in a corner wearing a sign that named her disgrace. I did not cry, and I want to be clear that this was not strength. I was too far past crying. When the dinner was mostly over and people had drifted into the loud, comfortable part of the evening, I reached up and lifted the ribbon off over my head. I held the cardboard in my 2 hands. I did not put it down. I walked to the front door with it. My Aunt Deborah watched me go and pressed her napkin to her mouth and said nothing, and I have thought a great deal since about all the different kinds of silence in that room. Vivian met me at the door. She was small and quick for her age, and she moved before my mother could see. She pressed something into my hand and closed my fingers around it. A folded $20 bill and a scrap of paper with her phone number written in her spidery hand. "Call me," she said low and fast. "Whatever happens, you call me." Then the door was open and the cold came in and I stepped out onto the porch into the snow and I looked back once. The porch light made a yellow circle on the step. Inside, they had already gone back to their evening. I shoved the sign into my duffel bag without looking at it again. I did not turn it over. It would be 15 years before I did. There is a version of this story where I tell you the next part quickly. A girl on a bus. A montage. A triumphant knock on a door. I am not going to do that because it would be a lie of a different kind, and because what happened in those years is the whole reason the phone rang the way it did. I took a Greyhound to Cincinnati because it was far enough that no one there had heard my name, and because a bus ticket cost less than a tank of gas. I ate a grilled cheese in the station diner and counted my money twice. That first week, I wrote a long text to my family. It was 3 paragraphs. I told them everything I had planned to say at Christmas. All of it. The truth about the car and the man and the lie I had signed. I read it 4 times. Then I deleted it because I already knew that no words I sent would land anywhere except against my mother's ability to explain them away. Instead, I called the number on the scrap of paper and Vivian answered on the second ring, and neither of us said much. And that was the beginning of a phone line that stayed open for 15 years. I got a job at the front desk of a legal aid office. It paid almost nothing, and it changed everything though I didn't know it yet. My job was to hand people intake forms and tell them where to sit. The people who came in were poor and tired and frightened, and almost all of them were fighting the same fight in different clothes. They were fighting to have their own names mean something on a piece of paper. There was a woman early on who leaned across my desk with a folder shaking in her hands. "They put someone else's name on my mother's house," she said, "while Mom was in the hospital. Now the deed says it's his." I remember that folder. I remember thinking that this was a kind of violence nobody called violence. The quiet crime of writing a person out of their own story while they were too weak to hold the pen. I wasn't a lawyer. I wasn't even a student yet. But I stayed late that night and helped one of the volunteer attorneys pull the recording history on that house. And I found the date the second signature had been notarized. And I noticed it fell on a day the woman's mother had been 200 miles away in a hospital bed. The attorney looked at me over the top of her reading glasses, the way people would keep looking at me for the next 15 years. Like I had found a door in a wall they hadn't known was there. We couldn't undo everything that had been done to that woman, but her mother's name went back on that deed. And I rode home on the last bus, understanding for the first time that the thing that had broken me might also be the thing I was built to repair. That spring, I enrolled in community college with the $20 long gone and 2 jobs stapled to my week. And somewhere in those first months at 4:00 in the morning between a waitressing shift and a class, I made myself a rule. It was not poetic. It was the only thing I had. No one gets written out of their own story. Not if I can help it. 15 years is a long time to keep a promise. I kept that one. The years that followed were not a triumph. They were a schedule. I set an alarm for 4:00 in the morning, and I did not turn it off for the better part of a decade. I waited tables until the lunch rush ended, sat in class through the afternoon, worked the legal aid desk in the evening, and studied on the bus in between. I transferred to the University of Cincinnati after 2 years, and it took me longer than it takes most people because I was paying for it 1 class at a time, and twice I had to sit out a semester to make rent. There was a winter I lived on rice, and the day-old bread the diner gave away at close. There was a stretch where I read my textbook standing up on the bus, because if I sat down after a double shift, I would fall asleep and miss my stop. Nobody was coming to rescue me, and after a while I stopped waiting to be rescued, and that waiting turned out to be the heaviest thing I ever set down. In 2015, I walked across the stage with a bachelor's degree and a plan. The plan was law school, and it was a professor who put the idea in my head. She had read a memo I wrote for a clinic about an elderly client whose family was trying to move money out of her name. "You read documents like you're looking for someone hidden inside them," she told me. She meant it kindly. She had no idea she was describing my entire childhood. The year before I started law school, I did something I had been circling for a long time. I went to the courthouse and I changed my name. My family's name is Ashby. My grandmother's family name was Halstead. I filled out the petition, I published the notice the way the law requires, and I stood in front of a clerk who looked at the form over her glasses. "And the name you're taking?" she asked. "Halstead," I said. I mailed Vivian a copy of the order. She called me crying, which she almost never did, and she framed it and hung it in the sewing room where she slept in the one house where 2 people still knew that a name could be a way of coming home. I chose trusts and estates. People assume that's a dry corner of the law, and I let them assume it. To me, it was the only part of the law that was about the thing that had broken me. It is the law of who gets remembered, who gets provided for, whose last wishes are allowed to stand. I wanted to work where a person's intentions still counted for something after the room got loud. I passed the Ohio bar in 2018. My graduation was a small one, folding chairs in a rented hall, and I almost didn't look at the back rows. When I did, there was a woman in a good coat sitting very straight, a little apart from everyone. Vivian had driven down without telling me, alone, at 80. She caught the whole thing from the last row, and then slipped out before I could reach her, so I wouldn't make a fuss. So no one at home would ever know she'd come. For 4 years, I worked as an associate at an estate firm under a woman named Judith Callahan. Judith was in her 60s and had no patience and a great deal of exactly the kind of loyalty I had never seen at home. "Rules protect the people who can't shout the loudest," she told me once, sliding a file across her desk. Remember that? Then, in 2021, she slid me the file that nearly ended me. The client was an 87-year-old widow named Alanna Pratt. Her relatives had decided, all at once, that she wasn't of sound mind, and they had filed to have her declared incompetent and to overturn the trust she'd signed, leaving her house to a caretaker who had actually shown up for her. If they won, they would also have me removed because I was the one who had drafted the document, and I was the one insisting it was valid. I sat at Alina's kitchen table more times than I can count. It was a small kitchen with a window over the sink, and it reminded me so much of another kitchen that some evenings I had to steady myself before I knocked. "The family says she wasn't in her right mind," the relative's lawyer told me, and he said it with the same warm, even certainty my mother used at Christmas. The partners at my firm began to waver. It was an expensive fight over a modest house, and the relatives were loud, and loud is contagious. There were nights I doubted myself, nights I went back through the file at 2:00 in the morning looking for the mistake that would prove me wrong, my hand actually shaking on the pages. At one point, Judith found me at my desk at midnight. "If you die on this hill, Halstead," she said, "you die alone." I almost quit. I had my resignation typed out on a Tuesday, the cursor blinking at the end of it, and I thought about how much easier my life would be if I let the loud people win just one. Then I drove back out to Alina's house at 9:00 at night and asked her the question I should have asked at the very beginning. Not whether she had proof, who she had written to when she felt most like herself. She thought about it, and she sent me to a closet. And there it was, a letter in Alina's own hand, dated the same week she'd signed the trust, written to her sister describing exactly why she was leaving the house the way she was, and exactly how clear-headed she felt doing it. It was not hidden. It had been in a shoebox, the way important things so often are. It settled everything, and it settled it because I had finally learned to look for the person inside the paper instead of arguing with the people standing outside it. When it was over, Alina took both my hands in the courthouse hallway. "You're the only one who read what I actually wrote," she said. I have thought about that sentence more than almost any other, because that was the moment I understood two things at once. I understood how I would spend my career, and I understood for the first time that one day I might be able to do this for myself. In 2022, I opened my own small firm. I put my name on the door, Halstead Trust Law. It was 2 rooms and a part-time paralegal and a coffee maker that only worked if you hit it, and I was 30 years old, and it was mine. The first month I had 4 clients and could not sleep, but word moves the way it moves, and the word on me turned out to be a good one. "She actually listens to what you want," people said, which is a low bar and somehow a rare one. I built it slowly, one honest file at a time. On the single stubborn idea that a person's true wishes are worth defending against a whole room of people who would rather rewrite them. I had spent my childhood being the exception to that idea. I meant to spend my career being the proof of it. I built it quietly. I did not get rich. My name never appeared in the Martin Weekly. As far as my family knew, I was still the girl who had shamed them and disappeared. A cautionary tale my mother could deploy at holidays. One afternoon, my phone rang with a number I hadn't seen in years. A Martin area code. It was my Aunt Deborah. Here is the part they never bothered to learn, and it is the part that matters most. For 15 years, Vivian and I had never actually lost each other. There was a shoebox on the top shelf of my closet, and it was full of her letters. She wrote in a looping hand on plain paper once a month, sometimes more. She sent me a card the week I passed the bar. She sent me a photograph of the framed name change order on her wall. And in one of the last letters, in a sentence I have never been able to read without stopping, she wrote, "You were never the disgrace in this house." We had a rule of our own. She and I never called the house, and she never mentioned me inside it. Some months she wrote from her car in the church parking lot, the only place she could be sure of an hour alone. The first Christmas after I left, she called me from that car with the engine running for the heat, and neither of us said much. And near the end, she said, "They're inside singing." And then, "I'd rather be out here with you," and hung up before either of us could cry. For 15 years, that was the shape of it. A woman in a cold car, choosing the granddaughter in the corner over the family at the table, one phone call at a time. She was the only person who never once asked me to make it easier for everyone else. Deborah's call was to tell me that Vivian was failing. I want to explain something I only fully understood near the end, because it answers a question you might have been carrying since the beginning. You might be wondering how a grandmother who loved me could have sat in that armchair on Christmas Eve and not stood up. The answer is the house. After my grandfather died, my parents didn't just move in. They moved in and they took the wheel. They decided when Vivian could see people and when she couldn't. They managed her the way my father managed a claim. By the time I was standing in that corner, she had already learned what standing up cost in her own home, and she was 80 years old and outnumbered. She didn't fail to love me. She failed to move. She spent the next 15 years making up for the difference, and she did it in a way none of them saw coming. I've put things in order. She told me on the phone more than once in that last year, "Don't you worry about the order of things." Over those years, she had gathered the truth about that October the way I gather evidence now, patiently and without announcing it. She had my account from the night I told her. She had a voicemail Grant had left her drunk in 2012 that she never deleted. And she had gotten my father in a weak moment to admit something to her that no one else knew. I drove up to see her in early 2026, quietly timing it for a morning when my parents would be at church so that I wouldn't have to see them. She was small under the hospital blanket the hospice had brought, but her eyes were the same. On her hand was the ring I'd watched her wear my whole life. We talked about names and about dignity and about what a person owes to the truth. She asked me at one point whether I was happy. And I told her I was mostly, and that it had taken me a long time to be able to say that word without first checking the room. She smiled at that. She told me the thing she regretted most in her life was not something she had done, but something she hadn't. On a Christmas Eve, a long time ago when her legs would not carry her out of an armchair, I told her she had spent the 15 years since carrying me anyway. One cold phone call at a time, and that it counted. She squeezed my hand and said she hoped so, and near the end of the visit she gripped my wrist with more strength than I expected. "When they come to you," she said, "and they will come to you, don't shout, just tell the truth and let it sit." She was quiet for a moment. "Warren has instructions, and Millie," her eyes went sharp, "turn that sign over, you still have it." I did not know what she meant. I told her I loved her. She wasn't finished. "Protect the child," she said. She meant Poppy, my brother's little girl, 7 years old and blameless. "Protect the child, don't rescue the rest." She died in February. It was a Tuesday and it was snowing, and I did not go to the funeral because I could not sit in a pew with the people who had managed her last years, and because she would have understood exactly why. After she was gone, her last words worked on me like a splinter. "Turn that sign over, you still have it." I did still have it. For 15 years, the cardboard had sat in the bottom of that shoe box under her letters, and I had always kept it face up, as if the 2 words on the front were the only thing printed on it. One night, I took it out and held it under the lamp, my thumbs on the worn edges, and I noticed for the first time a faint place where old ink had bled through the board from the other side. I had seen it 100 times and never once let it mean anything. I never got to turn it over that night, because that was the week a certified envelope arrived at Halstead Trust Law with the return address of a law office in the Columbus suburbs. The envelope was from Warren Prescott. He had been the family's lawyer for as long as I could remember. The man who drew up my grandfather's will, and it turned out my grandmother's. His voicemail was careful and unhurried. "Ms. Halstead," he said, "your grandmother was very specific about who she trusted with this. Please call at your convenience." I called. Vivian had named me the successor trustee of her trust. She had done it 2 years earlier in 2024 with Warren while she was clear and sound, and as it would matter later, well documented. The trust held the house in Martin and the savings my grandfather had left. A little over $1 million all told, and every decision about it now ran through my signature. My parents did not know that yet. What they knew was that Vivian was gone, and the house they had lived in for 18 years was suddenly not simply theirs. My Aunt Deborah forwarded me a screenshot from the family group text, and reading it was like hearing a recording of my own childhood. "Whatever Mother's lawyer says, the house is ours," my mother had written. "We took care of her." They still called me the disgrace who had run off. They had no idea I had spent 15 years learning to read exactly the kind of document that now decided their future. And they were at that very moment leaning on Warren to find the trustee and be reasonable, never once imagining that the trustee was me. There was one person in the middle of it who hadn't chosen any of it: Poppy. My brother had divorced a few years earlier, and his ex-wife Claire was a decent person who had gotten herself and her daughter out of that family before it did to Poppy what it had done to me. Claire sent me a careful message testing the water. "I don't want Poppy anywhere near this," she wrote, "but she asks about you." She found a picture. I read that and I understood all at once that Vivian's plan already had a place for the child. Protect the child. Don't rescue the rest. If I acted, Poppy was safe. I did not go into it as a wounded daughter. I went into it as a lawyer. I verified that the trust was valid and that Vivian had been competent when she signed it. I read the terms twice and I put the sign in my bag, still face up, because Warren had said there was something he needed to show me in person, and something told me the two things belonged in the same room. Before I tell you what happened in that office, I want to ask you something because we're at the turn now. They still believe I'm the disgrace who owes them. Before the lawyer says a single word, ask yourself what you would do if the family that erased you suddenly needed your signature to get what they wanted. Tell me in the comments. The second half of this is where all of it turns. Warren Prescott's office was on the second floor of a brick building with a view of a parking lot and a diploma from the 70s on the wall. He was older than his voice, careful with his hands, and the first thing I noticed about him was that he did not perform. He slid a binder across the desk and folded his fingers. "I want to be clear about my role," he said. "Your grandmother didn't ask me to punish anyone. She asked me to make sure her wishes were followed. That's the only thing I do." He laid out the terms plainly. The house was to be sold. The proceeds, together with the savings, were to fund two things: a scholarship for young people who had been pushed out or counted out, and a trust for the education of one grandchild, Poppy. My parents would receive nothing. My brother would receive nothing. And I would administer all of it as trustee. "You should know," Warren added, "that you are not a beneficiary. You don't receive $1 from this." She was very clear about that, too. She said you'd want it that way. I did. It studied something in me to hear it out loud. Whatever this was, it was not going to be about money in my hands. Then he set a small recorder and a slim folder in front of me, and his voice changed just slightly. "There's a letter she asked me to deliver to the family," he said. "As trustee, you decide whether I carry out that instruction. But she wanted you to see what's in it first." He pressed play. It was Grant's voice, thick and slurred from a voicemail he'd left our grandmother in 2012, 3 years after that Christmas on some drunk and guilty night. "Tell Millie," my brother said on the recording. "Tell her I'm sorry she took it from me." I had not heard his voice in years. I sat very still. Warren opened the folder. There was the old settlement, $85,000, my name on it, and there was Vivian's letter in her own looping hand. She had snorts written the whole truth, plainly. The driver that night was Grant. Millie signed a page to save him, and then a line I read 3 times before it landed. "Your father wrote what he knew on the back of that sign," she had written. "I made him tell me." I reached into my bag. I took out the cardboard I had carried for 15 years, the ribbon still threaded through the 2 holes my father had punched. And for the first time since I was 18, I turned it over. On the back, in the same blocky handwriting that had spelled out my public shame, my father had written a date. October, the year I was 18. And under the date, a name: Trevor Nash. I had been carrying his confession against my body the whole time. He had written the front so they would believe it, and he had written the back where no one would ever look because he could not make himself throw away the one true thing in that house. And I had kept it face up for 15 years so that I would never have to see what he already knew. I sat there in that office, and I felt 15 years rearrange themselves behind me. Every holiday I had spent alone rather than explain. Every time I had almost picked up the phone and then set it back down. Every night I had told myself I was making the whole thing bigger in my memory than it had really been. I had not been making it bigger. It had a date and a name in my father's own hand. And I had been sleeping 6 FT from it the entire time. Warren let me sit with it. He is a decent man. Then he explained without drama exactly what the family needed and why. They could not touch the house or the money, and they could not stop the letter from going out unless the trustee refused to carry out Vivian's instructions. And they had been leaning on him for weeks to make the trustee reasonable. He turned his phone toward me and showed me my mother's latest message to him. We just need the trustee to be reasonable and keep family business in the family. For 1 second, I'm going to be honest because the whole point is honesty. For 1 second, I wanted to make it easy for them. Again, I wanted to sign the softening version. Let them keep the house, put the letter back in a drawer, keep a fragile kind of peace. The old gravity of that family reached all the way across 15 years and pulled at me in that quiet office. I put my hand on Vivian's ring sitting on the desk where I'd set it, and I thought of Poppy, and I thought of the girl in the corner, and I thought of the letter my grandmother had made my father tell the truth into. Just tell the truth and let it sit. Warren waited. He did not push. He simply put a pen on the acceptance form on the line where the trustee signs. "1 word does it," he said. "Either way." I looked at the line where my name would go. The same hand that once took a pen, it did not want to sign a page, it did not write to save a brother who let me. This time the hand was steady and the name was mine, and I had earned every letter of it. "Proceed," I said. I signed it Halstead. Warren nodded once, picked up his phone, and the machine my grandmother had built began quietly to move. That afternoon, Warren did 2 things. He sent the formal notice to the beneficiaries that the law requires laying out the terms of the trust in plain language, and he delivered Vivian's letter to the people she had named. My mother, my father, my brother and Deborah by courier, and by email before the end of the day. The letter closed with a single sentence which my grandmother had written herself and which I will carry for the rest of my life. "Ask yourselves who the disgrace was." By the receipts, the first email was opened at 3:00 in the afternoon. My phone started at 10:00 past. I did not answer it. I sat in my office as the light in the window went from white to gold, and I watched the number climb. I want to tell you what those calls were because 42 is just a number until you know what it was made of. My mother called first and often. Her voicemails moved through the stages I knew by heart, cold at first. "I don't know what you think you're doing." Then wounded. "After everything, Millie, this is who you are." Then, near the end, something almost pleading. And even then, still about the only thing she had ever protected. "You think a piece of paper makes you better than this family." My brother called, too. His messages were not about the man he'd hurt or the lie I'd carried. They were about himself. "You're really going to blow up my life," he said, over a mistake I made when I was 20. He said mistake the way you'd say weather, something that happened to him rather than something he did. Cousins called, and uncle called, and left a voicemail that was mostly stunned silence. And then the words, "I didn't know, Millie. I swear to God I didn't know." And that one I saved. I did not pick up a single one of them, and that surprised me, honestly. For most of my life, the sight of my mother's name lighting up a screen had worked on me like a hand on the back of my neck, steering me where she wanted me to go. I had expected, if this day ever came, to feel triumphant, or at least finally vindicated. Instead, I felt very quiet, the way a house feels after a storm has finally moved off. I made myself a cup of tea, and I let it ring. My grandmother had told me to tell the truth and let it sit. Letting it sit, it turns out, is the hardest part and the most important, because the moment you pick up the phone, you have agreed to argue, and I was done arguing. By sunset, the number on my phone was 42, and there was one name that was not on it. In all of those calls from all of those people, not one was from my father. His silence sat differently than the noise. I understood it in a way better than I understood the calls. He was the one who had written both sides of that sign. He could not face me over a phone. That night, long after the calls had stopped, a text came from a number I didn't have saved. "This is your father, don't answer them. I need to give you something in person. My mother wanted a family meeting. Of course she did. She wanted it at the house on her ground with her script. And she framed it in the message she finally sent me directly as reconciliation. 'Come home,' she wrote. 'Let's fix this as a family privately.'" Privately. That word again, the same one that had covered the crash and the settlement, and 15 years of a story told at holidays. I had spent my whole childhood learning that private was where they did their worst work. So I agreed to come, but not to her meeting. I came as the trustee to do the walkthrough of the house that my role required, on a date I chose, with Warren present and with Deborah, who had asked to be there. And I brought the sign. Deborah met me on the porch. She was older now, and the nervous coat she used to wear had been replaced by something steadier and sadder. "You don't have to go in there," she said. "I do," I told her. "But this time I decide where I stand." Inside, they were waiting. Of course they were. My mother had set out the good china again, as if a table could reset 15 years. My father sat at the end, gray and silent. And my brother was standing by the fireplace with his phone already up, already filming, because that was the only move he had ever known, to make a record that made him look wronged. My mother started the way she always did, warm and even, her eyes already wet. "After everything we did for you," she said, "you do this to your own mother at Christmas of all seasons." It wasn't Christmas. It was April. But she reached for Christmas because Christmas was where she had one before. I didn't raise my voice. I have learned that the calmest person in a room is usually the one holding the truth. I set my grandmother's letter on the table, face down, unread aloud, and I asked one quiet question. "Do you want to keep telling this the way you've told it, or do you want to hear what everyone in this room already knows?" That was when Deborah stepped forward. She had spent 15 years being one of the silent ones, and I think she had decided she was done. "I was here," she said. And her voice did not shake. "I watched them plan it, I watched them put that sign on her, and I sat there, and I said nothing." She looked at my mother, not at me. "I'm not doing that again." Then Warren set the recorder on the table and pressed play, and my brother's own voice filled the room he was standing in. "Tell her I'm sorry she took it from me." Grant stopped filming. The phone came down slowly to his side. And for the first time in his life, I watched him look like the person he actually was instead of the one on the mantle. My mother reached for it anyway, reaching for the story, the way she always did. "That's Grant being drunk and dramatic. That doesn't mean." I turned the sign over. I laid it on the table between us, front side and back side both, and I put my finger under the line of blocky handwriting on the back. The date, the name, Trevor Nash. The room went quiet in a different way than it had 15 years ago. That silence had been mine, alone in a corner. This one belonged to all of them. I looked at my father. He had not moved. His hands were flat on the table, the way they had been on that other table the night he held out a pen. "I wrote both sides," he said. His voice was barely there. "The front so they'd believe it." He stopped. "The back because I couldn't make myself forget it." He had known. He had always known. He had made me the disgrace on the front to bury his son's crime, and he had written the truth on the back because some small, cowardly, human part of him could not stand to let it disappear entirely. And he had let me carry it, unknowing, for 15 years rather than say out loud what he had been able to write only where no one would look. Everyone in the room turned to my mother then, the architect. She was still reaching, her mouth already shaping the next version, and this time there was nothing left to build it out of. She tried anyway. She said the sign had been the lesson, that families do hard things, that I had always been too sensitive, that none of this would have happened if I hadn't insisted on making a scene at Christmas 15 years ago. Each sentence was a smaller room than the one before it. And I watched the faces of the cousins who had laughed that night, and I saw them do the arithmetic, and I saw the exact moment the story she had told for 15 years stopped being the story they believed. I stood in that room in front of the same corner they had once faced me into, and I said the only thing I had come to say. "You hung a price on me when I was 18, I said quietly. "You decided what I was worth and you wrote it on a piece of cardboard, but you don't get to name me." "You never did. My grandmother knew that, and now everyone in this room knows it too." I picked the sign up off the table. "After 15 years, I finally held it the way you hold a thing that belongs to you, not the way you carry a wound. I want to say something to you before I tell you the rest because we're past the worst of it now." Clear's throat. "If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and telling the truth about your own family, you already know how heavy one word can be. Whatever you chose, I hope you know it counted. Tell me about it if you want to." I read all of them. I did not burn the house down on my way out, and I did not need to. That is the thing about consequences that come from the truth instead of from cruelty. They arrive on their own schedule, and they arrive with your hands clean. The house was sold that spring, exactly as Vivian had written it. My parents had to leave the place they had lived in for 18 years. Not because I took it from them, but because it had never been theirs. And the woman who owned it had decided long ago where it should go. The money did what she wanted. It seeded a scholarship, and it filled a trust with $120,000 for Poppy's education, held safely where no one in that family could reach it. I did not receive a cent, and I told anyone who asked that the daughter they had called a disgrace was the only one in the will who got nothing and had wanted it that way. My mother's consequences were the ones she had built with her own hands over 15 years. Marden is a small town, and small towns talk, and the story she had told at church for a decade and a half turned out to have another side, and everyone heard it. That was not my doing. I never said a word to a single neighbor. She had simply spent so long protecting a name that, when the truth came out, there was a great deal of name to fall. My brother's West Point poster shine cracked among the people whose opinion had always mattered most to him. There was no arrest, no courtroom, no dramatic reckoning of the kind these stories sometimes promise. What happened to Grant was quieter, and I think worse for a man like him. The people who had believed he was better than the rest of us learned that he had let his teenage sister take the blame for a man he put on crutches, and then laughed while she stood in a corner. Some things a gold seal can't cover. I thought a great deal in those weeks about Trevor Nash. I did not go and find him. He had built a life since that night, and I had no right to walk into it dragging my family's wreckage behind me. But I made sure quietly, and through the proper channels, that the truth of what had happened existed somewhere official now in a form no one could unwrite, so that if he ever wondered whether he had been lied about, the answer would be on the record. Some debts you cannot pay. You can only stop pretending they were never owed. My mother sent one more message weeks later. It was long, and it was about how the family looked now, and how I had done this to them, and it never once contained the name Trevor Nash. I read it, and I did not answer it, and that non-answer was the cleanest sentence I have ever written. People ask me sometimes whether I forgave them. I want to be careful with that word because it gets used to mean surrender. My mother and my brother I have not spoken to since that room. I did not do it to punish them. I said as much to Deborah later over coffee. I'm not punishing them, I told her. I'm just done lying for them. There is a difference, and it took me 15 years to learn it. A boundary is not a weapon. It is a door you get to close. My father is a harder question, and I am not going to pretend it isn't. He is not innocent. He wrote the front of that sign. He held out the pen. He let me carry his confession for 15 years rather than say it out loud, and a small true thing written where no one would look does not cancel a large cowardly thing done where everyone could see. But he did write the back. He did, in the end, say it in front of the whole room, and so I did not slam the door all the way. I left it open the width of a hand on conditions, and the first condition was that he tell Poppy the truth himself in words a child could carry. And the second was that he stop pretending ever again that it had happened any other way. He is trying. Slowly. I am watching, and I am not in a hurry. And he knows he does not get to set the pace. The one I did not have to think about was Poppy. She never chose any of it when it was safe, and with Claire in the room, I let her back into my life a little at a time. She is a serious, funny child with her grandmother's exact way of narrowing her eyes when she's deciding whether to trust you. The first time she came to see the little place I keep now, I set an extra chair at the table before she arrived. When she saw it, she stopped in the doorway. "Aunt Millie," she said, "is this seat mine?" "It's yours," I told her. It always was. I gave her a book that day, a real one with her name pressed into the cover in gold. Not to buy anything, just so that somewhere in her house there would be a thing that said, plainly and permanently, that her name was hers. She runs her thumb over the letters the way I once ran mine over a worn edge of cardboard, and she has no idea yet why I had to leave the room for a second the first time she did it. There was one thing left, and that was the sign. I thought about burning it. I thought about framing it, which is a kind of trophy, and I have no use for trophies. In the end, I did neither. I turned it over so that the side facing out was the side my father wrote in secret, the date and the name and the truth. I put it in a flat archival sleeve, and I filed it with my grandmother's letter in the folder where I keep the founding papers of the scholarship her money built. I named the fund so that no child would ever again be the disgrace of a room, and I keep the sign there, truth side up where it belongs. When I was 18, I stood in a corner while the